Go ahead, Patrick.
A man can sue his wife, the dude whose wife cheated with, for breaking up their home.
Yeah, it's right. You're suing under alienation of affection. And the idea is that marriage is basically, in its most basic sense, what? A contract. So if somebody comes in and forces or helps to break that contract, then guess what? You can sue them for damages. And in this instance, there was the guy whose wife was working on her MBA. He told her that he was going, or she was going somewhere that she didn't go, left a Blockbuster card, and ultimately was having an extramarital affair with the 5-year-old son at the location. Under alienation of affection, if a man cheats on your wife, or cheats on you with your wife, why would you not want to sue your wife?
You're suing yourself.
Because you're suing yourself. That's half of yours is half of hers, basically. So you now can sue the person that is cheating with her. And what were some of the damage amounts that you could conceivably win?
100,000 or more, probably.
100,000 or more, probably.
It was like 50,000 or
50,000 or more, probably.
something like that.
Go ahead.
In the case, George Berg filed for divorce a few months earlier to the other adult and settled for $150,000.
What was the biggest case in Carolina history?
2001.
I think it was 2.1 million is what it was. And I believe this is law in like seven or eight other states, and it's in the box in the article. I don't need you to know all those other states, but the reason it's still there is they don't want to look like they're anti-marriage. Understand on this, if Maryland is not involved in this, but if you go to Carolina, for instance, where alienation of affection is there, and you sleep with somebody, in fact, that is married in North Carolina, you are subject to North Carolina law because you went down there and did it. If somebody from North Carolina comes up here, for example, and you sleep with them and they're married, even though you never left the state, they've got a tie to North Carolina, you're subject to that law and you can be sued. So even though the state is not here, the law is not in this state, the fact is that you can face a judgment from this law in this state if there is some connection to the state that's in question. If you remember, it was like Utah, Hawaii, I think Virginia was one of the ones. Yeah, there were a number of them that were on here. House advances felons. What was the bill in North Carolina dealing with this? Go ahead.
They're giving second chances to non-violent criminals.
Can you give me some examples of nonviolent felonies?
Non-violent felonies. I don't know, getting called a weed, stuff like that.
Okay, that could be. Go ahead.
Home invasions.
Home invasions. The article mentions B&E, or breaking and entering. The article mentions the controversial one. Go ahead.
Was another one like carrying, I think it was a firearm on school grounds?
Carrying a firearm on school grounds where it actually is not shot. This kind of a thing. So as you look at this, House advances bill dealing with nonviolent felonies. At the time of this article, North Carolina is the only state that does not give people a second chance or the ability to forgive or erase one nonviolent felony. If you have a felony on your record, what privileges do you lose? What's that?
Finding a job.
If you check yes on that job, or the application, it's going to be more difficult to get a job. If you can't get a job, what do people typically do? Anybody?
Can't get school loans.
School loans. It's difficult to go to college because, again, federal financial aid. What else?
Can't join the military.
Can't join the military. So if you can't get a job, you can't go to school, you can't join the military, what's the obvious thing that's left? Crime is. North Carolina is saying we want to forgive you of one nonviolent felony, and we want you to have a second chance because sometimes people don't always understand the decisions that they make. Do you remember what you had to do in order to get the nonviolent felony forgiven?
18 years.
18 years.
No. You had to turn 18? If you're like,
You had to turn 18.
yeah, something like that.
This law dealt with 17 and 18-year-olds, but what did you have to do?
You can only apply after 2 years. You can only apply after 2 years of your conviction and then 100 hours of community service.
Okay, 2-year probation, regular counseling with court-approved people, and in fact, oftentimes the judge, and then also 100 hours of community service. And if you actually did this, they would wipe away that nonviolent felony. They would wipe it away. I don't believe that North Carolina ever passed this, but the idea is that they would be giving you this second chance. The Texas cheerleaders actually had 3 articles on there, and I'll hit these really quick. As you look at this, we've got this whole Melissa Nelson thing. Do y'all remember that?
Yeah, I remember.
The woman that got fired because she was too beautiful. And I think it pretty well lays it out. This is a quickie, and I believe I had given you a link on that too. The drug sniffing dogs. How did that work?
Pretty much you're not allowed to bring a dog unless brought by a warrant.
You can't bring a dog onto somebody's property without a warrant. If you bring a dog, even if you don't enter their residence and they find the scent of weed so that in fact they justify a warrant, that's illegal. You're violating their property rights. If you notice in here, we had the drug sniffing dogs. We had a series of search and seizure type cases. So keep that in mind as you prepare for this. I mean, at some level, that there almost has to be a short answer that comes from this, at least for one or two of the classes. So keep that one in mind. What was the deal with the Texas cheerleaders?
They put Christian faith on a banner or something
Like
like
you,
that.
when you
At a
run
football game?
they use their own stuff to create the posters.
Posters of what again?
A banner.
Of like stuff
Going-
going
Do you remember what it said that they made?
God is for us, who can be against us?
If God is with us, then who can be against us? And the high school football team would run through this banner on Friday nights as they took the field. Now, there was some question on this, because were they allowed to continue to do this by the school? And there was an interest group, oh God, what was that? Freedom from Religion, I think is what it was.
Yeah.
Were they allowed originally to do this?
Yes.
Yeah.
No, they weren't.
Who was?
Initially, they were banned from doing this.
Who was?
The cheerleaders were. And it was actually this Freedom from Religion Foundation. The cheerleaders did the banners. They were banned from doing this for fear of a lawsuit. The cheerleaders did go to court, and they won in court. So as of now, they still can, but there's probably going to be more that happens with this. Okay, a couple of things. Number one on this, to your point that you had just mentioned, Kendra, you had said because they use their own stuff. They use their own markers. They use their own time. They paid for everything. They put these little signs around the stadium and a banner at the beginning. They're not trying to win souls, but they're giving religious messages. They're exercising, according to them, their free speech rights. According to the critics, what was the critics' argument? What is the school? What does the school represent? The state. And the state should be separated from religion. So if these girls are dealing with Christian-specific scriptures, messages, then guess what? If they're doing this on school grounds at a school function, this is not about free speech. They're mixing religion, and this should not be allowed, which should not be fair. But at this point, the girls have won. They're waiting for the appeal on this. And at this point, it's going to be very interesting to see where this ultimately goes. These are the articles from chapter 1. Pretty straightforward, I'd like to think. Now, getting back to the terms, did you have any other terms from chapter 1? Go ahead.
What are you supposed to know about political science?
Don't worry about political science. Don't worry about political science. Don't worry about politics. Don't worry about politicians. I won't ask you questions on those. If somebody could give me a scratch piece of paper. Thank you. Any other questions from 1? Okay, chapter 2, what do you got?
What don't we have to know for chapter 2? Let's start there. Boom.
Just keep asking questions.
5 chapters.
Come on, we gotta go. Chapter 2, yes.
1808.
1808, what was the 1808 clause?
Slaves, they had to stop importing slaves by 1808.
They were going to stop not slavery, but you're right, they were going to stop the slave trade. And they gave them, why did they give them 20 years?
So they could get used to the legislation.
So they could get used to the idea of living without slaves. So they banned, or they were attempting to ban. So from 1789 until 1808, you could participate in the international slave trade. After 1808, it would be no more. And then basically what they were going to do is, you've got 20 years to get used to not using slaves. Did it end slavery?
No.
What did it really do?
It caused them to breed.
It accelerated it. They imported more and more and more at increasingly high levels, and then they began to breed them, as several of you have said. Go.
Can you go over the preamble?
What's the preamble?
The introduction to the
The
Constitution.
preamble is the introduction to the Constitution, and I believe when I had mentioned this to y'all, I had said that the preamble is like when you write a paper or you give a speech. You tell them what you're going to tell them, you tell them, and then you tell them what you told them. The preamble is the introduction. Can you sue under the terms of the preamble? The preamble has no legal significance whatsoever. Go.
Can you go over ratification?
What's ratification of the Constitution?
You needed 9 out of 13.
You needed 9 out of 13 to ratify it, which actually will bring us to a different question. Somewhere up here, I've got the word fractions. What are the different fractions that y'all had to deal with so far?
3/5.
What's 3/5?
Where the slave is counted as 3/5 because.
Slave is, go ahead, I'm sorry.
Was it the South or the North that had more slavery because they didn't want to?
South had more.
Okay, South had more slavery, so they didn't want to pay as many taxes for
Right.
property.
Yes.
So then the North came up with the taxes, so then they said they would make it 3/5, so they'd still.
What did the South want the slaves counted for?
Seats of representatives.
Representation. 3/5 clause actually dealt with representation, or it dealt with representation and taxation. The idea is that 5 slaves equals 3/5, or pardon me, 5 slaves equals 3 slaves.
Oh, okay.
5 slaves equals 3 people, or 1 slave equals 3/5 of a person. And they're saying that a slave is actually less than a person. With this as well, the northern states wanted them to count more for taxation, but not representation. The southern states wanted them to count more for representation, but not taxation, and 3/5 was the compromise. What was 3/4?
You needed 3/4 of Congress to pass a new amendment to the Constitution.
You need 2/3 of Congress to be able to propose a constitutional amendment. What was 3/4?
Supreme Court?
Supreme Court?
Never mind. I thought it was the Supreme Court.
3/4 to ratify a constitutional amendment, 3/4 or 38 of the states. So 3/4, 3/5, 2/3. What was 2/3 in addition to ratifying or proposing an amendment? I'm sorry.
2/3.
2/3. 2/3 to ratify. Pardon me. 2/3 to propose. 3/4 to ratify. But what was the other 2/3 number? Overriding a veto. Overriding a veto. What was 13/13?
That.
Yeah, it's 1. Okay, that's true. 13/13.
Was it like the Virginia plan?
Not the Virginia plan. You needed to pass a law unanimously under what? Articles of Confederation. It had to be 13/13. So 13/13. 9/13 for ratification of the Constitution. 2/3, 3/5, 3/4. I think that's the extent of the fractions. Go ahead.
Can you go over the full faith and credit clause one more
What
time?
are the 3 things that I had mentioned to you in regards to the full faith and credit clause? 3 examples.
A law being able to apply in one state and the other? No, that's not.
If you have a binding legal document from one state, it would be recognized by all the other states. That is basically the gist of full faith and credit. What would be 3 examples of binding legal documents? Go ahead.
Driver's license?
Driver's license. That's why you can drive in other states. What was the second one? Marriage license was the tricky one, because if it's a heterosexual marriage license, then yes. If it's a gay marriage license, then no. It's not going to be recognized by all the other states. And the other thing was extradition back to a state where you were wanted for having committed a crime. All of these would be examples of full faith and credit. And let me stress to you, with full faith and credit, tax and spend, privileges and immunities in commerce, no examples for those. Others from chapter 2. Go ahead.
Virginia plan?
What was the Virginia plan?
Wasn't that when pretty much they had more representatives or something?
More representatives.
Unicameral.
Unicameral. Go ahead, Zach.
The higher the population of a state, the more relevant it was in elections.
Yeah, we're getting on the track now. The Virginia plan basically said that if you were a bigger a bigger state, then you should get more representation. And by bigger, if you had more population or if you had more wealth, then in fact, guess what? You should have more representation in the legislature. Now, this is where I tricked a number of classes, including, I think it was Deborah in the 1230, who blurted out that size mattered in the middle of everything. Yeah, and this happened in a number of the classes. The New Jersey plan goes hand in hand with this. So if the Virginia plan is size matters, what was the New Jersey plan saying?
Everybody should be equal.
Everybody should be represented the same. Virginia is known as the big state plan. The big state should have a larger voice because they literally have more voices within their borders. The New Jersey plan is based on equality. All states should have the same voice.